Hello, and welcome back to Living Outside the Matrix, the show where we examine important issues either ignored or misrepresented in the mainstream narrative. Hi there, I'm your host, Nigel Howitt, and on the show today we're going to talk about the fundamentals of how to know what's true, namely epistemology. This episode was inspired by a recent interview I conducted with Andrew Kaufman, a man of impeccable um, logic in his scientific research into germ theory and the existence of viruses. And so I was quite surprised to find that he drifted into an alternative epistemology. This became clear during our interview. And this episode has been inspired from that, basically. Just wanted to put out my thoughts regarding this issue, because we all need a means to validate what we can claim as our knowledge, and we need to know how to know things, and we need to know how to achieve certainty and make sure that all the ideas that we hold and act upon are actually valid and true. We don't have any automatic knowledge, we humans, not like animals that just sort of seem to know what plants to eat and so forth. But we do need knowledge in order to act successfully and achieve our goals. And hence, our need for a means to validate any and all information that we hear and receive, and indeed ideas that we generate ourselves, so that we can proceed to do things with confidence that we can succeed. So, an epistemology is a fundamental set of ideas that form the basis of our thinking, our method of knowledge validation. And the method that we use to discern what's real and what isn't must be grounded in the correct epistemology. Otherwise, in the long run, only failure and suffering can possibly result. So the first point that I'd like to make is that we all use an epistemology, even if we've never heard of the word. But our epistemology remains implicit unless it's specifically stated in terms of the fundamentals of our thinking, which of course it isn't. That would be impractical to do in everyday life. Implicit in this context means that it is necessarily a part of the mental process without being consciously recognized or verbalized. So, in the broadest sense, and for all practical purposes in validating information, there are really only two epistemologies. One that's correct and it's based on reason and logic, and another that is incorrect and based on faith and emotions. Now, I use the term correct here. It might sound quite bold, but I use the term correct here, assuming that successful action and the achievement of one's goals is always the desired outcome. The correct epistemology, in terms of this, is rooted in the acceptance of an objective reality that is knowable, and the incorrect one is not. Now, I must add here from the outset that epistemology is a very wide and comprehensive subject, and one of the base subjects of philosophy. And I'm not talking here about things like concept formation or the structure of reasoning, or any of the other subtopics. I'm referring only to the essential principles or lack of principles at the base of the concept of knowledge that distinguishes the essence of the only two basic approaches. And for the purposes of illustration here, I'm going to refer to the correct epistemology as the epistemology of reason, and the incorrect one as the epistemology of faith. And my purpose here is to show you why one is correct and why the other is not, and the dangers of using two, mixing them and flipping between them unconsciously. So, to begin with, these two opposing epistemologies come directly from two opposing views and corresponding views, two opposing corresponding views of the nature of reality. And now, of course, we're getting into metaphysics, the most fundamental branch of philosophy. And the basic issue is this: either reality is real and it exists independently of any consciousness, or it isn't and it doesn't. The important point to note is that if one adopts and holds as true certain ideas, such as, for example, consciousness creates reality, the Hermetic principle that all is mind, one is to that extent implicitly using what I call the wrong epistemology, as I hope to demonstrate to you. So let's look first at these two views of the nature of reality and see how they lead to opposing views of the nature of knowledge and the ability of the human mind to know reality. Rather an important issue. So the first I shall refer to as the primacy of existence. And according to this view, that which exists, the world, reality, existence, is what it is, independent of the content of any consciousness. Facts, existence, have metaphysical primacy. They come first, they set the terms. They are there, they are real, and they are independent of any mind or consciousness. Reality is an objective absolute, and consciousness, according to this view, is merely the faculty of grasping what is antecedently out there, what is antecedently and independently exists. So consciousness is simply the faculty of perceiving, grasping, identifying, coming to discover what is out there. The alternative view I shall refer to as the primacy of consciousness, and according to this, existence is a byproduct, a creation, a derivative of consciousness. Facts are not independent of people's beliefs, wishes, hopes, dreams, aspirations, etc. But facts are in some way created by or derivative of these various mental phenomena. So that if someone believes something, the act of believing it would require the corresponding fact to come into existence. According to this view, consciousness sets the metaphysical terms. It comes first. It is the primary, and existence snaps into line accordingly. These two views exhaust the possibilities, and they, of course, are mutually exclusive. It's either one or the other. So there are three important points I want to note here. Firstly, is that if the primacy of consciousness were true, then there would be no need for a system of validation. The thought would simply create the fact. The second is that the two opposing epistemologies arise directly from these two opposing and mutually exclusive views of the nature of reality. And the third point is that mainstream philosophy was hijacked and corrupted a long time ago, way before the mainstream media was consolidated into a handful of controlled corporations, before the medical establishment was taken over, and way before the extensive unseen influence over most of Western culture. And modern philosophy, it must be noted, advocates that consciousness creates reality, that reality is unknowable, and that the mind is impotent. In a nutshell, modern mainstream philosophy is totally on board with the wrong epistemology, and that's why so many people have been influenced to follow suit. Anybody who is a seasoned truth seeker will know that the truth isn't to be found on the evening news in the mainstream media. And you shouldn't be surprised, therefore, to find that in mainstream philosophical thought, which really precedes many of the ideas that are popular today, we shouldn't be surprised to find that ideas in mainstream philosophy are similarly incorrect, if not deliberately so. So the bulk of mainstream ideas promoted in our culture, in films, books, stories, think tanks, through NGOs, and coming out ultimately as government policies, promote ideas that implicitly rest on the epistemology of faith, including the idea of collectivism, as I hope to illustrate. Right across the board, the view that reality is an objective absolute is undermined. The only exceptions are things like the manufacturing industries and other areas where dealing with reality is inescapable. Only the correct epistemology of reason will actually work in these situations. For example, road building, construction of dams, creating infrastructure, certain areas of research and so forth, where you are obviously and directly delving into the facts of reality around you. You can't get away with the epistemology of emotion. So let's make a direct comparison then between these two epistemologies, that of reason and that of faith. According to the epistemology of reason, it's based on the primacy of existence, as I've mentioned, the recognition of reality, that A is A. And a corollary of this is that contradictions cannot exist. This is the epistemological corollary of the metaphysical principle that things are what they are. Existence is identity. For something to exist, it has to be something specific, and it can't be what it isn't at the same time as being what it is, and therefore we come up with this epistemological principle that contradictions cannot exist. This gives rise to logic. This is the basis of logic, and logic is the method it's our epistemological method, it's our thinking method, and this of course is the basis of thinking and reasoning as the process. Knowledge is achieved as a result with degrees of certainty according to the situation, according to the available evidence. We can arrive at degrees of certainty. So on the other hand, the epistemology of faith is based on the primacy of consciousness. Now, this inescapably means the denial of reality, because A can be anything. Contradictions can exist because miracles apparently can happen. Now, because it is denied that A is A, things are what they are, and to exist means to be something, there is no corresponding principle that contradictions can't exist. Contradictions can exist. So you effectively, according to this epistemology, have no basic principle. There is no method, there's only faith. Just accept things, that's all you can do. You can consult your emotions, or you can look left and right and see what everybody else is doing, consult the group, the majority. You can look to authorities, but you have no method. The individual has no means to arrive at any facts. No knowledge is possible. So because you're just accepting an idea, whether it's the idea of a supernatural deity or the idea that these stocks, if you buy my special stocks here, they're going to make you loads of money, all you've got is assertions and believing in them. All you've got is dogma. So in this context, certainty is impossible. blind acceptance is all you've got. And commensurate with that, of course, doubt can ensue, because our subconscious knows that we're holding an idea that's sort of floating. It's not integrated or connected with the rest of our knowledge. There are no reasons to justify it, to anchor it to the rest of our knowledge, and therefore to reality. So this is why, you can't escape having doubt if your whole worldview is based on this epistemology, or if any part of it is. So going back to the epistemology of reason, rational argument is possible based on the knowledge and degree of certainty and the facts and the reasons. You are able, or one is able, to offer reasons for one's convictions, and you're able to offer reasons why somebody else might consider changing their position. So debate, persuasion, negotiation, all of these things become possible. And note that this is the only means to peace, by rationally discussing things. Now, on the other side of that, with the epistemology of faith, rational argument is not possible, because reasons are not a part of the process. It's just about blind acceptance. So all there are is assertions. There's no possibility of debate. There's no possibility of rational discussion. All that can possibly result is disagreement, and therefore conflict, ultimately. It must be noted that the epistemology of reason implicitly supports every successful human action, and it ultimately is the only epistemology that can possibly lead to prosperity and abundance through economic exchange, through recognizing the facts of the needs for property rights, etc., and freedom. These things, freedom, prosperity, and abundance, can only come from consistent use of the epistemology of reason. On the other hand, the epistemology of faith implicitly supports mysticism and all forms of just believe this. Here's your creed, here's your dogma, here's the sacred text, just believe it and don't step outside of these parameters. And of course, this epistemology also supports the current mainstream ethics of altruism, and it supports the politics of collectivism, and it can only lead to tyranny, aggression, disagreement, combat, war, and intellectual stagnation, notably as well, because if reasons are not a part of our epistemological habits, our ways of thinking, if we're not habitually looking for reasons, there's no way that our knowledge can be expanded or corrected. The last thing to note in this comparison is that rights can be explained in terms of facts using the epistemology of reason, but they cannot be rationally explained at all if we're on the epistemology of faith. So notice that these two epistemologies are opposites. They cannot both be correct. One cannot be correct for some areas of human concern and the other correct for a different set of human concerns. If you want to know the truth, you must use the correct epistemology as a basis for all your thinking, whatever the subject matter. The correct epistemology has a guiding principle, that law of non-contradiction, and a method, and the other has neither. And this is why the correct epistemology has to be used to understand reality and to know how to act successfully, and the incorrect epistemology similarly has to be used in order to believe in anything for which there's no explanation using the correct epistemology. In other words, the wrong epistemology has to be used to justify the unjustifiable, or to accept an idea in the absence of any logical reasons or proof, and even in contradiction to available facts, evidence, and proof. It's also very important to grasp that the primacy of existence is an axiom. Now, this means that no proof of it is either possible nor required. It is the foundation of the concept of proof. The acceptance of this axiom is required because it's basically the presupposition of any rational argument. Furthermore, the primacy of existence is self-evidently the way things are. Everything that we do all day long, as we act out our lives, is based on the implicit assumption that reality is real and exists, and that things are what they are. Consider driving along a road, and anyone of sound mind would accept that they have to accept that you've got to follow the road. You have to conform to the road, not that the road is going to conform to your thinking or your views, your wishes, etc., etc. Also notice in the law courts that they recognize the acceptance of an objective reality as the basis of proof for adjudicating between falsity and truth in terms of conflicting claims and various cases in the law courts. If you want to do anything, such as make a meal, build a shelter, or do anything to achieve any result, you will be assuming implicitly, even if you don't consciously think about it or talk about it, that reality is real and independent of your consciousness. In other words, you'll be implicitly recognizing reality to be an objective absolute, and you'll be implicitly recognizing the primacy of existence by your actions, every one of them, all day long. And the epistemology of reason is based on this recognition of reality as being real and objective. The epistemology of faith, on the other hand, ignores or denies reality and permits any assertions to be accepted without facts, proof, or evidence. It allows any sacred text to be believed on the basis that it's the word of a supreme being. Or it allows, you could say, the word of the commander-in-chief in whatever context to be accepted without question. This is not the way for thinking humans to proceed. The next point I want to make is that using the wrong epistemology can become a habit. Now, most of the time as we go about our daily lives interacting with the world around us, we use the correct epistemology because we have to. It's the only one that works. Our faculty of reason, using logic as the method in the process of thinking, is our basic means of living. And it's grounded in the correct epistemology. However, almost all of us drift into using the incorrect epistemology at some time, particularly when we are considering or discussing things like the nature of reality, spiritual matters, or the subject of morality, particularly what's right, what's wrong, and ethics. And this is due to the ideas promulgated around us in our surrounding culture, all implicitly resting on the wrong epistemology, combined with the fact that we are culturally encouraged, if you like, to value feelings over and above our rational faculty. Things like political correctness are an obvious example, and scores of new genders, etc., etc., so that we tiptoe around and don't offend people, i.e. upset them, appealing to their emotions. It's facts are subordinated to feelings. So there are many negative consequences of using the wrong epistemology. The first one I want to look at and discuss is the negative consequences for our freedom. This is perhaps, I think, the most serious for our political, the impact on using this wrong basis for our thinking of not demanding reasons, etc., for our political freedom. And I don't think that it's possible to take a credible stand for freedom if one is in the habit of relying on the epistemology of faith. You have to reason for freedom. You can't simply demand it. You can't say that you feel you need to be free, or we feel that freedom is important. One must stand explicitly and consistently on the metaphysics of an objective reality, and explicitly and deliberately on the epistemology of reason, to defend and argue for freedom. The danger to our freedom begins with the acceptance of some mystical ideas or religion or various associated dogma, all of which lead to the acceptance of the morality of altruism. Now, I've talked about altruism before in this podcast and on my website. But altruism cannot be supported by any facts of reality because there are none that support it. It's a dogma. It must be accepted on faith. It holds that self-sacrificial service to others is the standard of the good, and that man has no right to live for his own sake, and that the only justification for his existence is the service of others, the community or the collective, as a moral duty. Let's bear in mind that freedom is a political concept, and remind ourselves that every system of politics comes out of and is based upon a system of ethics or morality. I use these terms interchangeably. Ethics directly affects politics because the question of how men should act individually necessarily precedes and informs the question of how they should act with respect to one another in a social context. Unless you consistently and deliberately use the epistemology of reason, how will you argue against altruism and the code of self-sacrifice, the ethical basis and moral justification of political collectivism? Unless you consistently use the epistemology of reason, how will you discuss rights as a moral concept derived from the facts of reality and the facts of man's nature as being a volitional conceptual consciousness? How will you argue for the right to live for your own sake, retain your own private property, and to be left alone in peace to act on the basis of your own judgment? How will you argue for this without reference to objective facts of reality and of man's nature based on an epistemology of reason? And I suggest that the answer is that you can't. Our political adversaries will only ever assert their lies and false justifications for political control. It's only reasoning and logical questioning that can cut through their propaganda and give the lie to their false ideas. It's only on the basis of A is A that you can expose contradictions as red flags of logical error and therefore expose lies. Mysticism, revelations, just knowing or following your feelings, these things won't help you to escape the tyranny of a totalitarian government. Only reason can offer an argument for freedom. Unless we truth seekers consistently use the right epistemology and not habitually flip between the two as we entertain fanciful ideas, spiritual ideas such as we're all one and unconditional love and all this sort of things, or to justify the unjustifiable, such as the existence of a supernatural sky daddy. Unless we use this consistent, correct epistemology, we will inadvertently relinquish the rational standard which is absolutely necessary to argue for freedom. This is the main reason why we have this contradiction. And for people that, in spiritual matters wanted to believe in God and these other sorts of things, reincarnation, the danger is that they're using implicitly the wrong epistemology, and it undermines their whole credibility and their stance for freedom, because they're going to be predisposed towards altruism. But there are more negative consequences which derive from the fact that using the epistemology of reason in the process of thinking is hard work, and discerning the truth takes effort. This is a fact. Consulting one's feelings, on the other hand, is much easier. It's on a comparison, it's virtually effortless. So there is a subconscious temptation to slip into the habit of using the wrong shortcut epistemology and predominantly listen to our feelings, implicitly taking them as guidance to action, instead of doing the mental work of reasoning and weighing evidence and arguments based on the epistemology of reason. This reliance on emotions causes several negative consequences, both personal and social. And let's do another comparison, looking at the two of them to help illustrate this. So as we've said, the epistemology of reason is based on thinking and reasoning. So this means that you have reasons to support the claims that you accept, and it means that persuasion and explanation is possible. So it means, in essence, that you can defend your convictions and you can argue to change the position, potentially, or the thinking, the convictions of other people. Now, on the other hand, if we're using the wrong epistemology, that of faith, if we're using our feelings and emotions, we don't have any legitimate reasons, and therefore we cannot either persuade other people, we don't have any means of persuading, and we don't have any means of having our position changed. We're going to be predisposed to cling to our beliefs rather than be reasoned out of them. It'll be far less possible to reason anyone out of beliefs, things that they've emoted themselves into. If you've emoted yourself into a position or a belief, it's unlikely that reason will help get you out of it. So the other important comparison to make is that on the epistemology of reason, your knowledge can be corrected, and indeed it can be expanded. You can add new insights and facts, and you can integrate them into the sum of your knowledge, understand the connections, and therefore grow your knowledge. And if you have an error in there, you can identify it and you can correct it. Now, on the epistemology of faith, no such possibility exists. And as I mentioned before, intellectual stagnation. You can't correct any error because you're not open to the reasons that would help you correct it. And very importantly, the next one is that on the epistemology of reason, we are much, much less vulnerable to fear-based propaganda. So as soon as the narrative puts out scary stories, the sky's falling in, the earth is going to overheat, and the climate catastrophe is inevitable, or you're going to die of a nasty disease, or the terrorism's coming to a town near you. All of these fear-based propaganda narratives will have much less impact on a consciousness that's in the habit of using the epistemology of reason, because although we might feel an emotional response, we won't be in the habit of listening to that as our guide. We will be predisposed to thinking, oh, that sounds scary, let's see what the evidence is, let's investigate and see if that's actually true. And also it means that we're less likely to emotional manipulation, less susceptible or vulnerable to emotional manipulation in our personal lives with partners, with business colleagues or friends or associates. We're not going to be as likely to be emotionally manipulated because, again, we'll be looking for facts. But on the other hand, the epistemology of faith leaves us very vulnerable to fear-based propaganda and very vulnerable to emotional manipulation. And this is why we see populations being so easily controlled by propaganda, because having set the stage with this epistemology of faith being so widespread, right down to the basics of mainstream philosophy being corrupted a long, long time ago, whole populations are listening to their feelings or what they're told or what everybody else does or what the authorities say. Whole populations are not reasoning, looking for facts and evidence, weighing arguments to determine truth. And this is very much a part of the reason why we are where we are today, with control being effected so easily over populations because so few people are thinking and using the epistemology of reason as a consistent method. Another point to note is that the epistemology of reason leaves you resilient to mind control. There's lots of talk about mind control in the Truther movement. I see mind control as simply programming and putting ideas into undiscerning and lazy minds, and minds that are not thinking, reasoning. So when you're on the epistemology of reason, you are much more likely to retain your independent critical faculty, and you will be more resilient to having ideas sown into your mind. You are more effectively a conscious gatekeeper of your mind, and ideas that you come across, you're going to question them, you're going to assess them, you're going to evaluate them, you're going to use discernment, weigh them up. Is this true? Do I want to believe this? Does this fit with everything else that I know? On the flip side, using the epistemology of faith, you are very susceptible to mind control, just like this fear-based propaganda. You're going to follow the crowd. You don't have an independent faculty based on facts, evidence, and reason, to the extent that you allow your consciousness to slip into this habit of using the epistemology of faith. And this is the point, is that you can slip into it. It's easier. Thinking takes effort. The last point to note on the negative consequences of using the wrong epistemology is that you're very likely to fall for logical fallacies. So even if an argument is presented to you, you won't spot the incorrect reasoning and the logical fallacies within it, and you'll be more likely to fall for it and go along for it to the extent that you are reasoning at all. Whereas if you're strictly and consistently using an epistemology of reason and thinking, you are very less likely to fall for logical fallacies. You may still be tripped up by some. There are many, and not many of us are well versed in logical thinking, but you are going to be much less likely to be tricked, essentially, by a fundamentally false argument that is not logically sound. So how do we avoid using the wrong epistemology? And the bottom line is that it's not okay to mix them. It's mixed up thinking. It's self-contradictory. So anyone serious about discerning truth, knowing what's real, becoming a credible thinker, must get their mental files in order. And this means identifying your premises. It means really digging down to the foundations with these subjects of epistemology and metaphysics, which might sound like a great big yawn to most people or far too intellectual to bother with, but they're really important. If you want to be a thinker, if you want to know the truth, if you want to be undupable, this is what you have to get your head around. So we have to identify our fundamental premises, correct them where necessary, and then make them explicit in our thinking. It's really important to be able to bring our deepest premises out of the implicit and make them explicit where we can see them and be conscious of them. Not literally see them, of course. So we have to make a point of committing to the epistemology of reason, assuming that I've persuaded you that it is the correct epistemology. And then we have to strive to be consistent. And the way to do this is to really go to the fundamentals, the bedrock, and say, yes, reality must be an objective absolute. And any ideas that I've been entertaining that implicitly rest on the fact that it isn't must be false. So we have to go right down to this basic premise and then look at our epistemology. Do we use our feelings? Do we consult others, the group or authorities? Or are we in the habit of looking for facts and evidence to seek proof and understanding? And understanding really means integrating things with the rest of the sum of our knowledge. If you can't join the dots in your mind, in your mental map of reality, and actually integrate an idea with all the others in a non-contradictory fashion, then you haven't understood it. That is the essence of understanding, integrating it in a non-contradictory way. So we have to create and make it a habit. We have to create the habit of thinking rather than relying on our feelings. And initially we have to do this very consciously. We have to acknowledge what we feel. It's real. Feelings are there and they're good. They serve a very good purpose. But when we've acknowledged them, then we have to think things through. We have to determine what we think from what we feel. We have to know the difference and also understand that it's the thinking that's going to arrive at truth and be able to determine the correct course of action. Look for reasons. This is really important. Always make sure you can explain your convictions. If you can't, then you don't understand them yourself. So initially, this may require you to throw out some of the ideas that you have previously held. Dare I say, it's going to require you to question whether or not you believe in a supernatural deity or any kinds of other ideas, such as we're all one. There's no evidence for this at all. It feels great, but there's no evidence for it. Other ideas such as unconditional love and that self-sacrifice is the standard of the good. There are many ideas that implicitly rest on a false epistemology, that of feeling and emotions, of faith. So you're going to have to reevaluate some ideas in this process of checking your premises and where they all lead. It's a process of identifying our ideas and then tracing them down to what they actually rest on, looking for the fundamentals. And when we get into the habit of doing that mentally, we're well on the road to being able to discern truth in every issue. Remind yourself, of course, that your number one golden rule, your fundamental epistemological principle, is that contradictions cannot exist. They don't exist in reality. So we must resolve them by investigation and reason to find out which is the contradictory claim. Contradictions can only exist in narratives out there. They can exist in terms of contradictory claims, and they can exist in our minds, of course, as contradictory ideas that cannot be integrated. This is quite common. Many people hold ideas that cannot be reconciled, and the truth seeker, I think the serious thinker, needs to do the work of identifying these and resolving the contradiction. So, by way of summary, there are essentially two methods of knowledge validation. One is genuine, the epistemology of reason, and the other one is not, the epistemology of faith. Become conscious of these two epistemologies and be aware which one is implicit when you consider your beliefs and convictions. I suggest that you embrace the correct epistemology, the one that supports scientific method, and use it consistently across all of your inquiries, including matters of spirituality and morality, and consciously reject the wrong epistemology. Be aware of the tendency to rely on emotions when using the wrong epistemology, and counter this by thinking, questioning, and always demanding proof, evidence, and a logical argument. Be consistent, because we can only argue for freedom with reasons. Lastly, note that the only way to avoid being duped in any matters, in anything, matters of spirituality, dodgy, phony stocks, or being tricked into anything, the only way to avoid this, being conned, misled in any way, mind controlled, emotionally manipulated, is to use an epistemology of reason, with a law of non-contradiction as your guiding principle and a consistent demand for logical reasoning. So I hope this summary of these two epistemological methods helps you. Thank you very much for listening to this. If you've got some value, please hit the like button, and on the blog page, please comment. I'm always interested to hear counter arguments or take any questions. And do visit the website, lawfulrebel.com. There's loads more there on thinking skills, the discussions about freedom, rights, and how the wrong morality is going to lead to collectivism and not freedom. So do check that out, and join me again for another episode of Living Outside the Matrix.
Change you want to see.